We're go. Outstanding. Cool. Well, welcome, and thank you all for sharing some of your day. This conversation is about network weaving, and it's about the Building Belonging project that this is a part of is about the arc of transformation. How do we transform ourselves, society, systems at a grand level? And we are super lucky to have some amazing practitioners today who've done a lot of work in thinking around network weaving as a catalyst for transformation. And really, I think each of us see it as a catalyst at all three levels: self, society, and systems. So what we're hoping to do over the course of the next 85 minutes or so is have a conversation about what that art looks like. June and Alexis and Curtis and David will be invited to share a bit about who they are, their current work, and some suggestions for how they have found network weaving a useful practice in their lives. And ultimately, we are hoping to leave people with a sense of how we can apply this concept to your life in a very concrete way right here and right now. So we're going to try to do all that in 85 minutes, which will be fun. So we're going to get right to it. The first invitation is for each person to introduce themselves. I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3 minutes each. And the prompt that I'm hoping folks will respond to is 3 things: I am, my people are, I belong to. Just a chance to sort of lean into your work a little bit. I'll kind of go around how I see people appearing here in my screen. So we'll go Curtis, David, Alexis, and June. Curtis.
I am, my people are, and I belong to, correct? All right. Wow. Just small questions. Well, I'm humbled to be with this wonderful group, humbled by the invitation, and grateful to be amongst teachers. My people are educators and learners, lifelong learners who bring both boldness and humility to their lives, to their work. And I belong to this amazing earth, which I am reminded of more deeply every day. One of the true blessings of this pandemic is connecting to our, kindred other species out there, and to the invisible world that we're still getting to know.
Thank you. David?
I am also humbled and grateful to be part of this group. Alexis, it's really great to meet you. I hope we have some time to connect one-on-one. I've been following the work of June and Curtis for some time now, and I'm grateful for all the contributions that you've made to this field. It's really advanced my thinking, and my work over the past 10 years really shifted where I've come from, where I've gone. My people are those who recognize that a different way of working together is possible and absolutely necessary, that the traditional dominant way of top-down hierarchical command and control decision-making, the mechanistic worldview isn't working for people or the planet. And that this journey of separation we're on is really pulling us apart and leading us into the deepest polarization, certainly of my lifetime, making it so hard for us to have a real deep and honest conversations with one another, and find the common ground that we do share. And I really do believe that there is a lot of common ground if you really dig deep enough into underlying values. I also feel my people are those who see the ecological crisis as the defining challenge of our time, and who really feel profound sadness when they sense into the state of the planet, and recognizing the biodiversity that's forever lost, and grieving for future generations. I'd say I belong to a generation of millennials who have an intense drive to contribute, who see that the system isn't working, who want to work for purpose, yet who perhaps graduated during the first Great Recession, now coming into their careers in the current quarantine, economic collapse, who want to find greater meaning in their work and make a contribution, but don't quite know how to plug in. And folks who are passionate about change, but can't find that in the traditional organizing structures that have been presented to us.
Cheers. Thank you, David. Alexis.
Thank you, Brian. It's an honor. I'm really grateful to be a part of this group in this conversation. And I'm just meeting Curtis and David for the first time. And already, David, in your introduction, I'm learning that you're my people. I'm Alexis Flanagan, co-director of the Resonance Network with Amy Thompson. And in my heart and soul, I'm a queer Black feminist DC girl. I'm a descendant of incredible ancestors who survived to make it possible for me to be here. And my people are visionaries and dreamers. They're believers that a better world than what we have right now is possible. They're folks who believe that we have the power to co-create that world and that it's on its way. My people are risk takers, people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get dirty and try to embody the values that we talk about. They're people who know that we'll make mistakes along the way, but we're willing to be vulnerable and be experimental so that we can learn and so that we can grow together, so that we can hasten our acceleration towards this world that we deserve. I belong to the collective of human beings and other beings that are inhabiting this planet at this time. I belong to the land of my people's origins. I belong to the African continent. I belong to the island of Ireland. I belong to the land that my ancestors bled into and where their bones live on. And I belong to the land that I reside on right now, which is the occupied land of the Piscataway people. I belong to the people of all of those lands that have held us, that have held my ancestors, the land that we've nurtured and that has just cared for us in return. And I belong to this incredible network of people that are called the Resonance Network, who are people in communities in the US and beyond, who are daring to try to do this, to try to accelerate our evolution into being who we need to be in order for ourselves, for the beings that we cohabitate on this planet with, and the planet herself to thrive. And so, in really personal ways, I belong also to my family and to my curated community of loved ones and to my canine ruler boss, who is probably going to make an appearance at some point on this call.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much. June.
Right. Well, I'm always excited to be with really wonderful, smart people and get a chance to talk together and listen. I'm really thinking a lot about my people, because I think in all my life, I felt like those who've been marginalized and hurt by the current system are my people that I really, really want to work with and care about. But I think lately I've also been seeing all the people who are doing the hurtful things, who are so angry, and just doing such awful, dangerous things for themselves and others, as my people too, that I need to better figure out how to reach out to and engage beyond the the hurt and meanness. I don't know how to describe it, but I'm just really trying to figure that one out. But I think it's really important. I'm seeing it more and more that it's really important to see all, see all, everyone as my people. I think, in the thing of belonging, I mean, I think it's like ripples of belongingness. And so, I have this wonderful little community here and where I live in Athens of people. But then there's this incredible whole networks of people who are doing hard, really innovative work, who, I belong to that wonderful, juicy, ever challenging, world. But then trying to think about, belonging has always been a hard concept, I think, for me, because I'm always sensitive to those that don't feel like they belong. And there's a lot of people in this world who don't feel like they belong anywhere. And so I want that to be part of the sense of belonging that I personally project, that some new notions of belonging that are just incredibly inclusive. So.
Yeah, I feel myself wanting to take a deep breath and just kind of let in all of that wisdom and longing, which I think I feel so viscerally from all of you. I can reciprocate a little bit, though, since I'll be doing a lot of these sessions. I will try not to do so every time, but in the interest of sharing the vulnerability that you all just offered. I am a middle child. I am a mediator, a connector, holder. I've always been very other-oriented. I'm the father of 2 little kids, a brother, friend, son. When I was 12, I went to, I guess, what could only be characterized as a self-esteem camp. I did not lack in self-esteem, but I think my mother wanted me to be exposed to people and maybe humble me a little bit, and it worked. And I had to self-define, and I defined myself then as a global citizen. And I still aspire to that sort of little c citizen. We all belong to each other. But I'm also an American and a white man in America with all that entails. And I've been sort of sitting with what that means and how we can reimagine that identity. My people are, I think, like all of you, people who are in the arena, who are trying, who just want so desperately to be better, who believe that we can be better. And who are going to work for it. I mean, Adrienne Marie Brown, who I think a lot of us look to, talks about working on excellence. So my people are those who are trying, right? We don't expect excellence, but we certainly can make our best effort. I belong to everyone and everything. And I think what I am struggling with in this moment and as part of this work is kind of like June. I think I felt most of my life that I've worked really hard to help other people feel like they belong, and haven't necessarily paid as much attention to what it feels like for me to belong. And so coming into what it looks like to not just hold others, I think a lot of you are facilitators and circle holders and space holders. So what does it feel like to be held and to trust that others are capable of doing for you what you try to do for them is something I'm kind of a learning edge, shall we say. Thank you all for the gifts of your work and your time. Did we? Yeah, we got to Curtis. I think Curtis kicked us off, and I'll have a chance to say a bit more about each of your work as you introduce the concept. So I think the concept, the next question, next invitation here is, so we're talking about network weaving in the context of belonging and transformation. And so what does network weaving mean to you? And we'll do about 3 or so minutes each. And why is this important for transformation or liberation? So we're going to go in reverse order this time. So I'm actually going to start with June, and then we'll go Alexis, David, and Curtis. So June, what does network weaving mean to you, and why does it matter?
Well, network weaving is a lot more complex, I think, than a lot of people think. It just means connecting people. But I think right from the beginning, and even more so as that concept has aged, I'm really seeing that it's really about, connecting people, so that they can co-create a world that's good for everyone. I've moved to emphasizing even more that particular aspect of network weaving. There's the network building, and certainly it's really important to connect people. But I think increasingly, like in my mind, okay, connect for what? And to me, I've always really been interested in, like, okay, network weaving for transformation, and what does that mean? And to me, it's about like shifting the values, the way our behaviors, and the way we relate to other people. And so I think that movement to, what I call self-organizing is just the key piece. It's like, if people can't see something that they think needs to happen and help it happen with others, finding others to begin to experiment and try out new ways of being together. And that's why I think I love working with Resonance Network, because there's this constant experimentation of positive new ways of being with each other that are not just trying to battle with the old, but are really allowing something new to emerge. And I think the thing that I've really seen about network weaving, that first, I could see that this different set of values and a way of interacting with others was critical. But I think in the last couple of years, I've seen that dismantling racism and hierarchy as a part of that shift is just the most important work that we can be doing, because you can't really work with others if you have all this dominant culture, white supremacy culture, keeping you from really having honest, peer-like, caring, creative relationships. That's not going to happen, because we're so embedded in this culture that has so long taught us to be critical of others and be perfectionist and have plans and whatever. So that's a piece of network weaving that I've really seen more recently, is so important. And the other one, how much time do I have? Should I be wrapping this up?
It's all good, June. Maybe one more minute.
Okay. So the other piece is just massive learning. It's like, getting out of that thing that doing and roadmaps and such are the thing we should spend time on, and realizing that if we're not spending huge amounts of time on looking at what we're doing, and really trying to make sense of that, and using that to help us see all these assumptions we're making that are part of this dominant culture that we're trying to move beyond. So just the emphasis on, spending massive times reflecting and making sense of what we're doing together.
And I think you all are being a little bit humble, but June also has founded and is the co-creator of the Network Weaving Facebook group and website. So I invite you, June, as we go through the call, to share more about how you're practicing this now. But I really appreciate that introduction. Alexis.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to just to get to work with June and to be mentored really in this work by June. I met her very early at the beginning when I started to work with Resonance Network. And one of the things that she said that we bring forward in our work is that network weaving is about tending to the relationships that make transformation possible. And so I think we think about that. I know I think about that in a really expansive way, thinking about, I think Curtis, you said like the seen and the unseen. And so like those relationships for me include like what is like emerging as a primary relationship for me, which is my relationship with the body of ancestors that come before me, you know, bridging to my relationship to the generations that come after me, right? Like in all of those in those relationships in between. It's about tending to our relationships with our bodies and what we can learn in our bodies, our relationship to spirit, and what we learn together when we practice inviting spirit in and connecting to spirit in the work that we do. When it's about tending to our relationships to place, right? As we are parts of communities, like what's our responsibility to the place that we are a part of. And we see community as that vehicle to think about building and cultivating those relationships so that we can do the things that we say will get us to the world that we want, right? Which are, you know, bridging difference, which are learning how to share leadership, which is creating systems that are equitable, which are creating communities that are thriving, that are being led by like the strategies and practices that that can emerge right out of our art, out of the stories that we tell, when we're able to connect with each other in this way. And so at Resonance, as network weavers, you know, we're hoping to cultivate a network of people who see themselves as network weavers and who see like our primary like organizing responsibility is to be tending to those relationships, the quality of those relationships, the depth of those relationships, constructing our lives in ways that create spaciousness for us to tell our stories, for us to connect across time and space to our stories, the stories of our ancestors, to have the audacity to tell future stories for our descendants so that we have something big and bold and compelling to live into with ourselves and with others. So I think that's what, like in the network, that's the flavor of storytelling that we're practicing, building those relationships, building that depth of connection that makes transformation possible, sometimes in an instant, if we're able to be willing to be vulnerable and connect with a real place, from a real place with one another.
So if you aren't currently a part of the Resonance Network, I assume you now want to join because that sounds amazing. Yeah, thank you, Alexis, for bringing that. I love the notion of thinking about network weaving intergenerationally. That feels attractive. I'll have to think about that. David.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say a big hell yes to everything June and Alexis said. That's for sure. So I guess just to build on all that, I see the work of network weaving or cultivating networks as the work of strengthening connections and a flow of communication and opportunities for collaboration across all different kinds of boundaries, across difference, across divides, across silos within an existing organizational system, across sectors. We're talking about across multiple organizations. Like, how can we strengthen the connections, the flow of information, the ways to work together that orient us around the things we care about collectively? Because as I said earlier, I really believe there is so much common ground if we dig deep enough, and there are shared purposes that can bring us together, but we need just enough structure, just enough of an organizing system or a way to orient ourselves towards some kind of shared purpose as we kind of co-create it together. And I think about the way that over the last 50, 100 years, organizing systems have been developed to have people work together, but they've been, at least in the global north, very top-down, very hierarchical. Decisions are made by a few, power is held by a few, and networks are really a return to how we naturally want to connect with one another. We want to connect in communities. We want to connect through relationships. We want to connect around purpose, around shared values. And networks can, I believe, bring people together within existing organizational systems, across departments, across silos, to work on some purpose that promotes some kind of social or environmental good. Maybe that's associated with the organizational mission, but that engages people who work in these traditional organizations in a new way around issues they really care about. But it's also just so essential to bridge these silos or these clusters that we've created for ourselves. Or it's natural that we join with people that we really resonate with, and the issues that we are facing today can't be solved by any one organization or any one group or any one action. It's necessarily going to require addressing the issue from many angles at once: poverty and racism and climate and women's and girls' issues and so on and so forth. And those issues, we can be coordinated in that work together. We can find solidarity in that work together. And I believe networks are kind of a return to the way that we naturally want to connect with one another. And again, just organizing systems such that we can continue to connect and communicate and share information and find ways to work together in a way that is co-creative as opposed to decided by a few at the top, where there's distributed leadership and decentralized leadership as opposed to a top-down hierarchy, where relationships are transformational and not transactional. We're not counting the kinds of relationships that we have with one another, and instead we're going deeper and finding that trust is really, the shift to interconnection is really the basis for why we act together, and really leaning on co-creative emergence as opposed to deliberate strategies that are defined by a few.
I find myself nodding along, like, yeah, get out of these bonds that are so resonant, and yet here we are. So we're starting. And I'm also realizing that we're introducing terms that not everyone may be fluent in. So as we talk a little bit about things like emergence, we can maybe offer a sentence or two about what that is or how you understand the term. Curtis.
I was muted. Yes, yes, and yes to everything that's been shared. What more can I add other than just to say yes to that? I mean, I guess one of the things I would say is that why network weaving? Why, especially now? I've been thinking a lot about Joanna Macy and this notion of the work that reconnects, and thinking about how a lot of what seems to be off point and taking us in a perilous direction is either because we are disconnected from the things that actually feed us, and we are connected to things that actually poison us, right? And so it's not just the work of connecting, it's also the judicious work of disconnecting. And it is not just the work of connecting. One of my pet phrases I use is, connection is only as good as what's moving through the connection. And so obsession with connection is kind of, to me, a little bit of a perpetuation of the old. It's a perpetuation of our obsession with form. And what we need to move is to flow, to understand what's actually dynamic and moving, right? And so I see these social network maps out there and I think that's great, that's wonderful, but what's actually moving? What is dynamic here? What is moving from whom to whom? Is that even of value? And what does it have to say about the larger picture? So thinking a lot about those things, I have to say, I feel like I'm in a little bit of a disruptive space to myself, which is good. And so I'm sort of walking around with a little bit of a sense of, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. So I'm asking myself, what do I know? And what I think I know is that, we do need to reweave these strands. We're discovering so much about the world, right? The popularity of fantastic fungi right now, and Paul Stamets' work, and all these writings on fungi, and these invisible networks that are actually the networks that sustain us, right? That tree doesn't exist, but for the fact of the roots underneath it. And it's not just about that tree, it's the tree communicating to that tree. And guess what? That sustains me. And so there's so much of this pattern that we're just starting to understand. So what are these fundamental patterns that support life? So to me, it's about reconnecting with life and liveliness and genuine livelihood that is deracinated, disconnected from what is extractive and oppressive and supremacist. And supremacist, yes, in the white supremacist, but also in the human supremacist idea that we are the top species and deserve a place on this earth, you know, and screw the rest. Well, guess what? That's a recipe for our own demise, and we're moving there fast. So I love the fact that humility connects with humus, connects to ground. And so I'm thinking a lot about what is it about connection and flow that can ground us in what's real, what's true, what's life-giving, and connects us, what I think is the epitome of human expression, which is love. So let's weave away, but let's weave away to the things that matter, that sustain us, and that bigger we, that we are just a small part of.
Beautiful. Well, it took us about a half hour, but we got to love, which is it needed to happen at some point. Maybe 5 minutes of kind of open space here. If folks, you know, you had a chance to react to what was said before you, but if anyone wants to pick up on any threads that were put out there, let's have some time for that. Floor is open.
Well, two things that stood out for me as this idea of Curtis's, the thing of flows. And I do, you know, I'd love for us to think more about how we can move the conversation to flows. You know, and you know, I think Alexis' thing about spaciousness, and I think that is, you know, it's just like we're all liking more white space on a web page or whatever. There's that sense of where's that, you know, how that spaciousness, I think, is really connected to flows, that it's spaciousness that allows the flows to start happening or something like that. So I'm just seeing a neat little connection there between those two concepts. Maybe somebody wants to elaborate a little bit more on that, Alexis or Curtis, but.
There's the poem, and I'm going to get it wrong about who wrote the poem, and maybe if there's notes for this, I'll get it after the call. But it's the fire poem, and it talks about the space between the logs, right? And how like the space between the logs is like how that fire burns, right? It's how that fire flows.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, especially thinking about like where we are right now in this pause, you know, it's because of the pandemic that we're in. It's creating space. It's creating space for, you know, when Curtis, when you said flows, I immediately started to think about just like a principle of shared leadership, and like where has flow been able to happen, where others have been able to come into this space and lead because of the space that has been created by these circumstances, right? Slowing down long enough to center and trust and follow the leadership of folks who are most impacted and who know that community is the leverage point for our survival, first and foremost, and that it's the leverage point for the kind of transformation that we want to build in the world. And so, so I agree, June, that spaciousness and flow definitely go hand in hand.
Well, and I love, Alexis, that you just brought in that poem, because that's what popped to mind for me, Judy Soren Brown's Fire. Yeah, we use it all the time at the Interaction Institute when we talk about the practice of facilitative leadership, which is thinking about leadership as being fire tenders, right? Not saying fire is bad, it certainly can burn us, but it can also be the fire of possibility and creativity. And so how can we become those you know, managers of those stewards of maybe of fire, but you've got to create those spaces to let flames move in different ways. And it's just making me think about, just coming back to that point about flow, is I'm just thinking a lot about energy, and energy that is, you know, what creates the systems through the forms that we actually create. And so it channels energy in certain ways. And so we got to dismantle and reweave, right, those structures so that energy can move in new ways and manifest in different ways for, right, different people in different ways. So yeah, flows, fire, energy, loving it all right now.
You know, and just this whole pandemic, all kinds of new flows. I mean, there's just so much self-organizing that's happening. But how do you make a flow so that's the way people feel like life can be, every aspect of their life? How can they do getting money, getting food to people who don't have access to food now? How can that be a model of changing our entire economic system? That's what I want to, I want people to be thinking about, that kind of the role network weaving of people, of helping people see what they're doing. It's so amazing, and to see the possibilities of what they're doing could be a much bigger part of their life.
So we might have to invite June back for a conversation on changing economic systems, which will be held shortly with a few other folks. Before we move on to the next prompt, David, optional if you feel like jumping in, no obligation, or we can keep going.
We can keep going. The actual thing that's really resonating with me right now is Alexis's beautiful artwork all over your room. I'm recognizing all I have behind me is one plant. But I think it just, if I could tie it to networks, I would say that that they can be spaces where we can kind of bring our full selves or more aspects of ourselves, and folks are invited to in kind of traditional organizational spaces. And as I had a conversation with June recently, that we ourselves as humans have many different parts that connect together, that we ourselves are a network, that we bring many different identities or parts of ourselves to bear, and that in co-creating these spaces where there is spaciousness, with a grounding of love and with humility, we can connect to each other in ways that allow for a sense of wholeness, not only bring our whole selves to the work and to the community, but also the community is able to be more whole as a result.
Yeah, and it's making me think of not just connecting with others, different aspects of ourselves, but reconnecting just within ourselves, things that have been lost. I guess the one thing I'll offer, and then I'll offer the next prompt, is I've been thinking a lot about attention. And as Curtis was talking about energy, it's sort of reminding me that our energy begins with our attention, right? What we pay attention to is where we direct our energy and create the opportunity for cultivation. So I think one of the shifts that I'm in right now, and I fail at probably several times a day, is really trying to only give my energy to those things that are the kind of positive connections that Curtis was talking about, and find myself sort of, unplugging my attention and energy from those things that are not serving the kind of person I'm trying to be in the world. Easier said than done. So if you have figured that out, please let us know. The next prompt, and yeah, obviously, please feel free to continue building on each other here, is let's try to ground this a little bit. So this is a group of people who are deeply schooled and familiar with networks. If you're not, this might feel a little bit abstract or theoretical. So how do we ground it? So what does this look like in practice? Feel free to speak to your current professional work. Any other context you want to bring into the space is fine. But 3 or so minutes each, how do you apply this in your work? If we're trying to bring this down from concept into lived experience, can we speak to that? And we're going to mix up a little bit. We're going to start with David and then go Alexis, June, and Curtis.
So the way I think about cultivating networks in practice is that it starts with purpose and people. Underneath purpose, we could also talk about values that we share, principles that we share, but bring people together around shared values or shared purpose that we can orient ourselves towards. That's really where it starts, and that the next critical step, my perspective, is to build deep, trusting relationships with one another, and that requires us having the space and vulnerability and bravery and invitation to bring ourselves to the work, to kind of take off our professional hats or the persona that we present ourselves with in a lot of professional spaces. I mean, everybody here watching this, you see me, you might make perceptions about me, judgments about me, but we really don't know anything about each other until we actually create the space and the opportunity to hear each other's stories, to connect at a human level, and so I getting people connected around shared purpose, shared values, and then building deep, trusting human relationships with one another leads to everything else. But a few of the other practical steps are, first we think of how can we support each other's existing work? What are the things that's already happening that we can really build on, that we can coordinate, connecting the dots, right, completing the triangles, and then looking at the whole system and identifying. I think Alexis brought up the term leverage points, those places where a small shift might have profound implications for the whole system, kind of building on the work of Donald Mellows and others, and begin to organize ourselves around some of those issues, but with just kind of enough structure, not too much that it actually stifles the creativity and the self-determination and the co-creation that's possible, the self-organizing that's possible, but just enough structure. I think Curtis brought up, so that form follows function. We're building the structure as we go so that it supports our ability to self-organize together around issues that we care about, and that doesn't actually stifle or predetermine where our self-organizing is going to go, where we might go.
David, can I just ask you to say maybe just a minute about, I'm thinking about, you wrote an article, well, several articles, but the one I'm thinking of in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, you talked a little bit about your experience with a network in California. And I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit to how you've seen this work in practice, because I think the principles you're offering are awesome. And I'm curious for folks who haven't experienced it firsthand, what that might feel like. Sure,
yeah. So that's a lovely example I like to return to, and the Santa Cruz Mountain Stewardship Network. And was started in 2014, continues to this day with local leadership. And the question there is, how can we steward or support a large landscape, 500,000 acres of land, where the land crosses jurisdictional boundaries, it crosses government lines, multiple organizations, many private landowners, Amamutsan tribal band, academic institutions, this patchwork quilt of different groups that own or manage different parcels of land. Well, stewarding a single parcel of land is a biological issue. It's an operational question, but an entire landscape requires us to come together across organizations, across communities, across divides to look at the whole system at once, and find ways that we can kind of support each other's work in stewarding the land, but also have sort of systemic or region-wide strategies that can promote ecological benefit. For example, invasive species being just an easy example here. If you can get rid of all the invasive species in the land that you own, but if your neighbor doesn't get rid of them, they're just going to come back. And so it requires coordination, collaboration across. And so this network was a deliberate exercise in bringing together 22 organizations in order to build connections, share information, find ways to support each other's work, and then do new things together to support the entire landscape so that their purpose, so that human and natural systems thrive for generations to come. And just to return back to the importance of those trust-based relationships, why I really see that as the core, because there are groups like one of the timber companies and the environmental nonprofit who have been sort of at odds for 100 years, but only by actually having space to learn about each other, to share each other's perspectives, their stories, to find that common ground, they did recognize there's actually a lot of overlap. They both care about a thriving region that can continue, that's sustainable. They're both afraid of the threats of climate change and development. And so out of that, there have been some, a new incredible land deal between the timber company and the environmental nonprofit that collectively stewards the land in a new way. Meanwhile, the Amamutsan Tribal Band is working with Cal State Parks, a government agency, to help restore the Coast Valley to what it was and pre-colonial, and also to engage the tribal members of the Amamutsan Tribal Band in teaching Cal State Parks the stewardship techniques that they've used for generations. So networks as a way of bringing people together across organizations, across divides, finding that common ground, building relationships, and out of that, with self-organization, with just enough structure, and with the right kind of leadership, a servant, kind of steward leadership, facilitative leadership that's not top-down directive, but really supports the whole. That's what emergence is really about, that new things can emerge that we couldn't have prefigured or pre-planned ahead of time. It's really creating the spaces and the conditions so that systems can flourish.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, I'm appreciating the wisdom and even the weaving of different concepts here. I appreciate that. Moving around the way I'm seeing you here, we're going towards Alexis.
Thank you. Thank you for that, David. I appreciate the framing around purpose and people, so I'll talk about it in that way for Resonance. In terms of our purpose, Resonance Network has its origins in a project called Move to End Violence that is focused on building a powerful movement to end gender-based violence, specifically in the US. And our purpose as a network, as we grew out of that, is around this question about what does it take to transform a culture of violence? Because gender-based violence manifests itself against, certain bodies, but gender-based violence is rooted in the same violence that we exact against the earth itself, right? So if we're going to think about transforming a culture of violence, we're not just talking about interpersonal violence and state-sanctioned violence and these kinds of violence against particular bodies. We're talking about a broader transformation that is required for humanity, for us to get to a place where we can be interdependent and all thriving together on the same planet. And so that's how we orient ourselves towards that purpose. And so we have a theory of transformation about a culture of violence. And our theory is that number one, that if we're going to transform a culture of violence, there's got to be widespread alignment with a bold vision for a world where violence isn't normalized. And we do work to engage people in creating that vision, like in creating that worldview and cultivating it and tapping into itself. And what we find overwhelmingly when we create these spaces for folks to engage in art and engage in storytelling and to be creative and to just have spaciousness to tap into their creative selves together, that people come up with the same vision, right? People tap into something else that connects and that resonates in terms of what we deserve. And so that's one way that we practice weaving, is that we help people discover that together that they are holding a similar vision for the world that is worth fighting for. The second component of that theory is that transforming a culture of violence is only possible when there's individual commitment to personal transformation. Like, we have to do this. Like, this starts within each one of us. It's not someone else out there who needs to transform. It starts with each of us. And so deep commitment to that is necessary. And so we create opportunities for folks to like engage in practice around what we refer to as the seeds of the world that we want to live in, right? And to practice, what does it mean to be connected and centered in my body? What does it mean to be connected to spirit? What has spirit meant for my people, and how is that still resonant and important? And how is that important to me interrupting violence as it shows up in my life, as it shows up in my body, as it shows up in the choices that I make each and every day? The third part of it is that the theory is that deep relationship building in communities where people can experiment and practice with alternatives to dominant culture is what's going to create the norms that are going to move us towards that. And so, we create the opportunity for people in the network to see themselves as part of community and to understand what that means from an individual purpose. From an individual purpose perspective, what does it mean for me to be a part of a community, and what are we working towards together? And what does it mean for me to call the networks and communities that I've been a part of my entire life, maybe in some instances, into this question of purpose? Like, oh, like we've been in relationship together, and now toward what end, right? How are we leveraging this relationship to bring about the change and the transformation that we want to see in the world? And then the last component of that theory is that transforming a culture of violence requires that there's the will and the capacity to create the systems that reflect these values. And we're only going to develop that capacity by practice, right? We've got to be willing to fail forward. People have to be willing to be in reflection about themselves, with others. One of the things that Resonance is known for is that, like, just the courage and vulnerability that people have to jump into individual reflection with each other. It's central to our equity practice. Like, we talk about this openly all the time, right? Like, how is my internalized racial oppression showing up in this meeting right now? How is it, how is it impacting the choices that I have made, what I've decided to share or not share, whether I decided to speak first or not speak first, right? To be in the practice of noticing like the habits of dominant culture that show up in us all the time, and what we are doing, what we're practicing instead to interrupt them. Like, those are some of the seeds that that help us build our relationships together within the network. And so we share those reflections in a lot of ways. And one of the central practices is through storytelling, right? Just returning to an ancient practice of like tapping into an other wisdom that there's the story that's asking to be told in this particular moment, and what becomes possible when we cultivate our relationships by listening for that story and telling that story, and seeing the space that it opens up for for growth and for transformation to happen. So those are some of the ways that we're practicing in the network, Brian.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think I'll put in the YouTube chat the 3 C's, because I think when I first came across them, I was like, how, this is everything I've been looking for and hadn't yet articulated, and you just did it. And it's deeply powerful. June. Okay,
well, just building on the beautiful stuff that Alexis said, maybe being really pragmatic, the trick is, how do you get people to really have that confidence and skill to be able to self-organize and collaborate successfully? And a number of networks that I'm working with are doing a combination of, self-identifying network weavers or network activators or whatever, who are maybe one step further along in understanding network weaving than others, but can learn together and can begin to model for the whole network, what does it mean to be in this new way? And combine that often with innovation funds or seed funds or, whatever they're called, where people get small bits of money for collaborative projects in their communities. And that is just a way to jumpstart. And often network activators can work with these projects to help them be more successful, because we know how to self-organize. People are doing it all the time, but whether they're doing it, in a transformative way. And that has a lot with what Alexis was talking about people being able to get together and tell their stories and interact in new ways in the context of a somewhat limited project that makes it easier to take the risk of being in new ways. And then I think when you get those kinds of sets of groups, and they can come from an innovation fund, or a Resonance has done real, they brought healers and artists together, and given them some resources to do some projects, but then bring them together to say, oh, well, what if healing and spirit and art were all combined in new, interesting ways? But the idea is of people learning together, and making sense of things together and coming up with new insights. Is the third piece of that. So, I think there's just, those are little chunks that people anywhere can do. They can add an innovation fund. They can bring network weavers together to deepen their skills. And then there can be lots of spaces and places for learning. And I think those kind of real small, practical kind of things that you can do can really move a network into that space of being transformative.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the concrete thoughts. Curtis.
Yeah, just building on all of that. I'll offer the example of Food Solutions New England, which is a network I helped to launch about 9 years ago and continue to be the lead facilitator for. And that network launched at a time 10 years ago. Can you imagine? We were talking about our global supply chain of food being fragile. Here we are now. And so what happened at the time is there was a vision for this 6-state region that we call New England, to come together to really be more sovereign around its food supply, and for purposes of food justice, for the purposes of local, state, regional economic development, for the purposes of ecological sustainability and shortening these supply chains, but also in engaging in the new economics, right, which is a network enterprise undertaking, which is getting these flows going more locally, which you, June, know all about through your work at AceNet and the like. And so there was this recognition that the region needed to see itself as more of a region. And so that began with exercising this, this network muscle of convening, of bringing people together and bringing them together across various boundaries. And so convening can be a great way to weave, and being strategic about it. Who needs to come together, who is siloed, isolated, who is not typically part of this conversation, to whom we should offer an invitation. And then once people are in the room, all different ways that you can do to sort of weave. And so wanting to lift up what Alexis was saying around storytelling. Every network launch I've facilitated includes this 20-minute storytelling exercise where people share their story in 7 minutes and people reflect back values. And what people often say is, I feel like we did 9 months of work in 20 minutes. Now I feel like I know you. And we often share the stanza of poetry from William Stafford in his poem, A Ritual to Read to Each Other, which is, if you don't know the kind of person I am and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others created will prevail. And following the wrong God home, we will miss our star. So this idea that building connection is not just now that I know Alexis and that's great, and that is great. And what else does that facilitate? If we're rewiring, we're reconnecting the system so that new things can happen, new flows can happen. And of course, the more deeply you can, the deeper those connections are, the more likely we are going to share things that really matter. We'll give more of ourselves, which brings that abundance to the network. And so there's convening, there is facilitating connection, and there is weaving. And so we actually, through Food Solutions New England, have 3 lead weavers, all senior leaders of color who are supported with funding to go out and weave connections in various communities that are peripheral or were peripheral and now no longer are. And so now we have this much more diverse network 10 years later, which includes voices, not just voices of, but the representation of food chain workers, which includes the indigenous tribes in our region, which includes other sectors that had not been part of this effort previously. So there's very intentional weaving, and weaving that is not just about bonding, but bridging to some other place, right? To bring in new possibilities. So we've thought very strategically about where we meet and how meeting in a place like Bridgeport, Connecticut, for example, can bring something to Bridgeport and also bring something to the wider network, which is what we did when we did our 6th annual food summit back in 2016. And there's a beautiful story that played out because of that choice to have a convening in that location. So I guess the one other thing I'll mention is just the use of the virtual tools for 6 years now. Food Solutions New England, Karen Spiller and I have been co-designing and facilitating, along with Lisa Fernandez and Dr. Joanne Burke, the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge, which was initially an exercise for the region. And now this year we just wrapped it up. We had 7,000 participants from 22 different countries, multiple sectors, participating in this sometimes synchronous, often asynchronous exercise of learning about what race and racism and white supremacy have to do with food and our food system. And it just gets more robust each year and has an underlying network logic and theory of change, from moving people who are not paying attention to paying attention to connecting to actually organizing and working for change. And so much more work to be done there, clearly, but some other examples of what we're doing is to weave the new.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, 7,000, that's awesome. One thought, and then we'll open the floor to some reactions here. Curtis, the poem you were just offering was reminding me of this quote that I think is attributed to Theodore Roosevelt, that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. It's sort of just reminding us of the power of stories, and sort of recentering and why this matters to folks, opens up the possibility for curiosity. Maybe 5 minutes or so, if folks have reactions to what was said. Or if we're all just sitting in that collective wisdom, we can bask for a moment and move on.
And obviously there's a lot of resonance. And we've all, I think, had different experiences working with different networks. And I just wanted to reflect how much kind of overlap there was between what we shared.
And I just want to point out that if you want real practical stuff, you can go to the networkweaver.com webpage, and there's a resources section. There's probably 50 now free resources there that you can use in your network weaving. But I also would love to have more stories. I mean, these stories are so great, and would love to have a way that we could commit to gathering more of these stories for people of actual places that are trying out, new ways of being together.
I second that. Everybody should subscribe to the Network Weaver newsletter.
Thank you.
Yeah, a third to that. One other thought just popped to mind, because I realized that some of these big examples of national networks and regional networks, I've sometimes encountered people saying, well, that's not what I'm doing, and I don't want to build a network. And so I think there are just some of these small things that are not so small that we can do with a weaving mentality within our organizations, our communities. I was just on a call with a bunch of leaders from Ohio over the weekend about this. And I sometimes boil it down to, in June, bow to you for all that you've taught me over the years about this, as well as Valdis Krebs and Madeline Taylor and Pete Plastrick and Adrienne Marie Brown and so many other teachers out there. But this idea of, make connections, not just for your own sake, but for the benefit of others, right? So connect others. When you create those triangles, closing triangles, it becomes it strengthens the structure, multiple triangles. But then animate those connections by making generous offers. Make offers. And then also make requests, which sometimes means modeling vulnerability, but saying help. I need this. Do you know where I can go for this? Can bring a network alive. Again, whether it's a small team, an organization, a community, a neighborhood. And we're seeing lots of evidence that right now around mutual aid networks all over the place.
You are both leaping ahead to our next prompt, our penultimate prompt here, which I appreciate. So I'm going to give you two different possibilities to react to. One was kind of what you were just speaking to, Curtis, which is what is one practice you would offer to invite others into beginning to embody or enact this in their work, in their lives? So if you're trying to enact network weaving, what might that look like right here, right now, after we sort of end this Zoom call? The second question, which is a variation of that theme, if it feels more comfortable to you, is someone in the live chat asked this, which is, what advice would you give to aspiring weavers? What traits are important to practice as one embraces this work? So two different cuts in the same theme, which is how do we begin to embody this as we head out into the world? So I'm going to start with Alexis this time, and then we'll go Curtis, June, and David.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for bringing in one of those questions. One of the things I think that struck me the most when I started to understand network weaving by this name is the generosity of the people who are weaving me into networks, right? And so in terms of practices or something that people can do, like I even think about it more of a stance, right? Is that we have this stance around generosity. Like one thing that makes networks different from a lot of dominant culture spaces and even organizations is that we're not holding on with a tight fist, right? That we are co-creating, we're learning together, and my social capital, my relationship with this person, like all of that is open. I'm holding that with an open hand, with a generous hand, with a desire to share and to connect and to make introductions and those kinds of things. But something else that has become really important for us to think about and to be in practice about when we are creating and cultivating spaces for network weaving to happen is to really be in practice around thinking about how you're resourcing to like ensure the possibility of participation from folks who are typically siloed from these spaces, right? And so in order to create equity, and so like equity resource pools are, something that like it's just built into any kind of space that we create. So whether that means making sure that there's sufficient resources to support the accommodations that need to be made, the accommodations for language justice, accommodations for accessibility in other ways, but also like when we're cultivating physical spaces, like that there are resources to support dependent care for folks who need to be there, who want to be there, who would otherwise be isolated because they are caring for loved ones, or making the possibility of bringing families or bringing caregiver along with them for people to be able to participate. Compensating folks who would actually have to give up pay in order to be present in a space and to participate in a space. Like those are the kinds of things that we don't necessarily immediately think about as like the tools in the network weaving like in the network weaving bag. But what we realize is that if we want flow through the network, if we want the participation, if we want to like honestly live our values and center the leadership and the participation of folks who may be siloed and isolated, then we actually have to put the resources behind making it possible to eliminate barriers for participation.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that into the space. Curtis? And for these, just we're looking for like maybe 1 or 2 minutes each, sort of simple, kind of one something people can grab onto.
Yeah, the first thing that pops to mind is this permaculture principle, which is to step back and observe. And I think for aspiring weavers to be curious about the patterns and connections that already sustain life in that place, whatever that place may be, is a critical first move, given that so much of what sustains is invisible, at least through a dominant culture lens. So stay curious, listen, see what's already connected and moving, and maybe what needs more connection and flow, but ask the system before you intrude.
Appreciate that. June?
Well, I'm thinking of something that would be applicable to everybody, which is like, take your meeting, your next meeting, and just see if you can shift it more to some of the network values. So, can you have a Google Doc that has the agenda and invite everyone to be part of constructing that agenda? And then when you have facilitators for a meeting, are they representing the true diversity of people around that issue, and making sure that that's a proactive kind of thing that you can do, is make sure that people leading the session are representative of your network. Then the idea that in your meeting you have the time. I mean, I've been in resonance meetings where people are checking in with each other in the meeting, and somebody has something that's just like come up that's really painful and hard, and being able to give the space to help that person deal with the issue that came up. But it all to spending enough time on people building relationships, and that might mean going into Zoom breakout rooms so people can, in groups of 2 and 3, so people can really start telling their stories to each other. And then, in your activities, that thinking you don't have to all be together all the time, but can, easily break into smaller groups where you go off and people have more space for their ideas, and they can talk about how they can apply what they've been learning to their situations. So, and then making sure there's enough time at the end for not just, what went well, what could we do better, but really, what insights did you get from this meeting? What assumptions got rattled during this meeting? Those kind of deeper reflective questions. And so those are things anybody can use in a meeting to make it more network-like.
Thank you, June. David?
Sure, yeah, I just want to emphasize the importance of strengthening the informal networks that connect us together. We've been sharing examples of, myself, I've been sharing examples of more formal networks that have a lot of attention and resource behind them, and that's really not possible in many cases, and it's not even the best approach in many cases, because there are these informal networks that connect us already that, for example, to be really practical, if you're working in an organization that's advancing some kind of social or environmental cause, like think of the other organizations or the other groups either in your region or across that are working on a similar issue or maybe a tangential issue, and think about how to strengthen the connections with that other group, just to understand who they are, what they're working on, what they care about, what you can learn from them. Complete the triangle, introduce other people to each other, as Curtis said, for their benefit, not necessarily your own. Create connections that don't have necessarily an explicit purpose. It's okay not to know exactly where it's going to go. And it's okay also not to continue pushing it forward kind of into perpetuity. Just strengthening the connections at one present moment will lead to positive ripple effects. Just to call out something that Brian did for me a few weeks ago, started a local group in Seattle of practitioners that were starting to get together once every 2 weeks on the phone with very little agenda other than just connecting and learning about each other's work. And that group has since sunsetted because it was the right time, didn't need to continue. We were convening in other spaces, but already I've been able to reach out to other people for support and have had calls with other individual people in that community. It's inspired me to deepen my connections with them and learn more about their work. And so some really practical things that anybody can do just to really double down or lift up on things that have been said over and over again here, but really want to call them out, taking space to share stories, to really just a simple prompt like, tell me the story of why you do what you do. Tell me the story of a mentor who changed your life, right, or a transformational period of your life. And it's interesting hearing Curtis share the story exercise that they use. It's one that I've seen many times too. It's extraordinarily powerful, where people are just given enough space and time just to share uninterrupted. It transforms what's shared, especially when the listener is also listening deeply and empathetically. It really changes what is flowing between them. And so focusing on strengthening the connections between us really before we get to action or think about what are we going to do together. People are very often impatient with when are we going to get to action? What are we going to do? But actually the work of building and strengthening relationships and understanding each other is the work. That is the work, and will flow towards everything else. And then to lift one more thing that was brought up, another really practical thing that's easy, that does get to the work of action and makes people feel like they're getting something of value out of it that's supporting their own work, is just a really simple exercise. Do any convening or any call where folks have the chance to say, here's something that I'm working on or interested in, and I need X, or I want to have a conversation about Y. Right? Just a space to lift up those requests, and then other folks can raise their hand and say, oh yeah, I can connect with you around that, or I have something, I need a conference room for XYZ. I am looking for information on this topic. You'll be surprised at how often people are willing to support your work if you just make that request, which is a vulnerable thing to do. And those then deeper connections can happen offline in a different space. People can find those, and people can also in the same space make offers. I've done research around this, and I'm happy to share. That's a really easy way, just in 15 minutes, to make connections that are really focused on supporting each other's work and the work that we already do. And that really creates a virtuous cycle where then we're building relationships as individuals, and we're finding ways to work and learn together, which then strengthens our relationships, with then connects us to others, and the informal networks spread, even if there's not formal convenings or a really well-resourced process that continues into the future. Just that moment alone at Spark creates ripple effects that beyond which you'll never know where they lead.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I'm looking at Curtis, as I think he just shared on LinkedIn this morning, a graphic of a virtuous cycle from Daniel Christian Wall. And I guess what my response, I think that's what's coming up for me right now, is something I'm working on too, which is how do we transcend the false binary between being and doing, and sort of this urgency of the now versus the urgency to act, and sort of taking up Alexis's invitation from the Resonance Network, which is like, it starts with us. And so reimagining how we be in the world is in fact a transformative act of doing. And so I think one of the things I struggle with, and what's real offer back that I've benefited from, looking at each of you on this call, is the work you do as network weavers and curators, putting out the Network Weaver newsletter June, Alexis, the working with Resonance, Dave with Converge and SSIR, and Curtis, everything you write on your blog at IISC, and these acronyms I'll explain and put in the show notes here, is transformative. Like, I myself have transformed profoundly just by interacting with your work. So even the role of, you don't see the flows often, it's one of the hard parts of being a network weaver, but they're there. So the invitation to close here, and I do this with reluctance because I could keep this going. I would love to just see what happens. But is maybe to return to where Alexis started, which is this, why do we do this? Why do we care? Why does this matter? And so the prompt is, how will the world be different if we do this? So if we practice network weaving in the embodied way that each of us is striving to do, what might that look like for the world? What will change as a consequence? Just a minute, whatever comes to mind for you. I know it's an impossible question, but just a little teaser for folks who are seeking to join us a little bit. We're going to start with June, David, Curtis, and Alexis will get the last word.
Well, I would love to see just people co-creating all over the place, and a life that just felt more relaxed, more engaging, more centered in our communities, and just more experimentation, more justice, more flow. The flows would be really, really different than, I love the thing of a forest of bamboo, and underneath are these rhizomes that, the resources are flowing where they're needed. And if you cut down one shoot of bamboo, the resources all flow to that place and send up another shoot. I love that sense of our world and our communities.
That's beautiful. Thank you. David?
Wow, well, so much. And we've talked about how healing the planet and healing our human communities requires addressing these challenges from many different angles at once. There's not any one thing. It takes many different people, many different communities, many different actions. And I hope that through this work, people will recognize that we are all connected, and that all this work that we do, whether whatever kind of issue focus it is, or even what region you're working in, it's all connected as well. We have so much to learn from one another, and I really believe that the global consciousness and awareness is waking up, that people are recognizing that we are all connected. It's never been more, I think, apparent than right now in this pandemic. And I believe part of our job is to help accelerate that rate of transformation by building networks of networks, by connecting the various clusters of action and communities that are working together. Building networks of networks that share purpose, that share values, and seeing that we're all collaborators in this work. There's really no competition when it comes to healing the planet. So this is the future that I want to co-create with you all.
Curtis?
Well, what I hope we're setting ourselves up to do with this work, again, reconnecting it to the work that reconnects, is it feels like, this network weaving and even the network literacy that I feel like these times are calling for, as viruses expose other viruses of racism and oppression, and what fear-based sort of action creates in our world, is this work of reconnecting is really a reclamation of who we are. It's kind of like the remembering, as they say. So if there's a connection to our fuller selves, reclaiming of our bodies, our feelings, our spirits, if there is a connection to the so-called other, right, as John Powell would say, as a natural extension of who we are, and also a connection to the reality of the heinous acts, right, that have been wrought on so many people. A reclamation of truth, a reconnection to that so that we can work it through, and then a connection to these ecosystems that are our life support. Well, that puts us in right relationship as a stance for moving forward, even as it heals us, hopefully.
Sounds good to me. Alexis?
So I think the world would look like Black and brown and Indigenous women and girls and femmes not being endangered, but being present and thriving. Our leadership that is rooted in our deep connection to ancestral wisdom and reclaimed practice and community building is at the center of how we are shaping our strategies, how we're designing our thriving communities, that communities are leading and making decisions for themselves, that the leadership of these folks are like at the center of what governance looks like. That throughout society, conflict and harm are being addressed openly, that something that harms someone is seen in relationship to the entire community, and we're able to resolve conflict in ways that leave people and community intact and create pathways and possibilities for folks who have harmed to return, to heal, that make healing and wholeness possible for everyone involved. And there's a deep, widespread connection and connection to the truth, and just like understanding that kind of experience and that kind of existence is new and not new, right? That it's a weaving and a bringing together of ways of being that are ancient and that made it possible for us to continue to be here. And it's a centering of what is going to be necessary for us to continue to thrive, because the planet is telling us she don't need us. And we have some choices to make about whether or not we're going to continue to be around. And I just believe that centering the power and the wisdom and the leadership of Black and brown and Indigenous women and femmes is part of the answer to how we get there.
I love this and all of you, and yeah, just a deep gratitude for everything you have done and continue to bring into the world. All four of you and the communities you are part of and in relationship with. It's just I have personally benefited from the deep gift that is your collective experience, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to bring you together. Two quick thoughts on next steps, and I also want to thank the folks who are following this conversation over in the YouTube channel. We'll post sort of all these resources so you can find out more about Curtis, Alexis, June, David, their work, the networks that they're part of. We will also, sort of mindful of the accessibility point that Alexis brought up, make sure we get a transcript up for folks who want to track that. The invitation to each of you and to everyone, frankly, is this is open source. This is community created content. We want this to get out. So repurposing for podcasts and other uses is not only welcome, but indeed encouraged. The next two conversations, sort of on a nice note to end on, given what Alexis was just speaking to, one is on narrative and one is on conflict transformation. How do we, repair from a place that centers right relationship and community and relationship. So I'm going to stop the recording and the YouTube live broadcast, but deep gratitude to all of you for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian, for practicing network weaving and bringing this and other groups together.